This is part 2 of the Absolutism era in Europe, picking up with the English Reformation. As you see, religious leaders in England had called for reform since the 1300s. Henry VIII is going to come to power, and his break with the church is not going to be for religious reasons, but it's going to be for personal reasons. So this is a whole story. Hollywood couldn't even make up a better story than this. This is just some crazy right here. So the break with the church would come from religious leaders, or not from religious leaders, but from the king, and it's for personal reasons. Henry VIII will be a defender, a staunch defender of the Catholic Church in his early years as king. Henry VIII, he violently defends the Catholic Church at first. He did so. He did such a good job with it. The Pope gave him the title Defender of the Faith to reward his loyalty to the Church. Now, Henry will actually go as far as to impale Protestants. And once again, impaling is taking a tree trunk, sharpening the end of it, and putting someone on the top of it, and letting gravity do its work, pulling the body through, pulling the body down on the tree trunk. It's extremely gruesome and painful. However, Henry has a personal issue. And you can watch this stuff here, documentary on Henry VIII, 8 minutes. I'm put it up for you. It's a good little quick summary. In 1527, Henry VIII asked the Pope to annul his marriage to his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because he had not had a son by her. She would not bear him a son. Now, the Pope is going to refuse because he didn't want to upset the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, because that's Catherine's nephew, and Charles V had held the Pope hostage in Vatican City for 2 years and threatened him and said if the Pope messes with his family or him, he'd come back and kill the Pope. So don't think that the Catholic Church just didn't act on principle and, you're not supposed to get a divorce in the Catholic Church. It was corrupt. Nobles and kings got divorces quite a bit. So for the Pope to refuse Henry VIII the right of a divorce, or what Henry VIII felt was a right of a divorce, was a slap in his face. And he wanted another wife. To complicate this thing a lot more, Catherine of Aragon, which is where she's from, Catherine was an English war hero. In the early 1800s, Henry VIII went on a campaign down in France, fought a war down there. Didn't really matter much. He was successful, though. But at that time, the Scottish invaded England, and it was Catherine's leadership that saved the day. So the English population loved their queen. It's not like she was just a quiet queen, or she was beloved by the English people. So when the English people start to hear that Henry VIII wants to get a divorce from her, they do not like this at all. So, Henry VIII is furious. He decides to take over the English church with the help of Parliament. Laws were passed that made Henry VIII the sole head of the English church. And Henry VIII then appointed a new archbishop who quickly annulled the king's marriage. All the while, since I think it was 1526, 1527, he was having an affair with soon to be his second wife. And as you see, here is a list of his wives. His second wife was Anne Boleyn. And so Catherine of Aragon bore him a daughter, Mary. And when they got and by the way, Catherine of Aragon saw her role as queen as that's what she's supposed to do. She was a devout Catholic. She prayed for Henry. Henry had many, many, many affairs on her, sometimes right in front of her face, and she prayed for him. Keep in mind, Henry also married Catherine, and Catherine's first husband was Henry's older brother who had passed away. So she prayed for him and thought her role was to be queen. Anne Boleyn was in Catherine's court, and Henry dated her for like 2 years right in front of Catherine's face and danced with her, which was a big no-no and all that good stuff, had an affair with her. He ends up marrying her, and she promised him a son. Back then they believed that they believed that the women controlled the sex of the baby. We know today it's the male, but they didn't know all that stuff back then. So Anne Boleyn promised him a son. They had a love affair and all that good stuff. The papers hounded Anne Boleyn, called her flat-chested, called her all of these dirty, dirty names because they hated her. She was 18 years old at the time. I think Henry was in his late 30s, 40s. The English people did not like Anne Boleyn. So and she did not like him having affairs on her. She would scold him. She would get on him. She would bother him. And when her baby was born, it was a female. It was a girl. And so actually Henry brings her up on charges of treason. She basically changes her attitude. Allows the affairs to continue, worships him, basically says he's a great king, and basically she did this so she could pay $500 for the executioner to come from France, who was a professional executioner who would behead her in one swipe. Back then, the axes got dull, the swords got dull, and it'd take 4 or 5 swipes to behead someone, all the while you're living through each one of them, so she didn't want that. And she did it for her daughter. Henry VIII promised her that he would allow her daughter to live. He marries Jane Seymour next. Jane Seymour was in Anne Boleyn's court. Jane Seymour bore him a son, Edward IV, I believe, and she died in childbirth at 18 years old. So these are the next groups of wives he had. So you're going to do some research on those, all of those. As you see here, the legacy of King Henry VIII after his death in 1547, the rule went to his 10-year-old son, Edward IV, or Edward VI, maybe is the 6th. Edward dies in his teens, and the throne then is passed to his Edward's Catholic sister, older sister, Mary, Catherine's daughter. She's known as Bloody Mary. She converts England back to Catholic Church. She rumors that she bathed in the blood of Protestants, like they would fill a bathtub up with Protestant blood and she'd bathe in it. She died in 1558. When Mary dies, Anne Boleyn's daughter becomes queen, and that would be Elizabeth. Elizabeth I becomes queen. She brings the Protestant church back to England, and she brings moderate reforms, and she's known as one of the greatest leaders of England, the Elizabethan period, the Northern Renaissance under her. So, Queen Elizabeth I. As you see, she ascended the throne in 1558. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII. During her reign, this small island became the leader of the Protestant nations and laid the foundation for becoming a world empire. She tried to keep France and Spain from becoming too powerful by supporting first one and then the other, balancing their power. She was a great politician as well. In 1588, Spain sent an Armada, a fleet of warships to invade England. The fleet that sailed had neither the manpower nor the ships to be victorious. The Spanish fleet was battered in numerous encounters and finally sailed home by a northward route around Scotland and Ireland, where storms sank most of the ships. What this does is basically it sets up England as the world naval power for the next 400 years. Basically, Britain's going to relinquish that title in the 1930s to Japan. and Japan's going to hold on to it until World War II. So, Parliament limits the English monarchy basically after Queen Elizabeth passes on. The throne passes to James I. James believes in the divine right of kings. He offended Puritan members of Parliament, and they fight over money. He also is the king that has the Bible translated from German into English, King James Version of the Bible. I think he does this in 1611. And you got to remember, King James, he's a partier. He loves spending money on lavish parties, so that's why they're going to fight over money. And he's the head of the church, and he's going to use a lot of church money for his personal endeavors. King Charles I is James's younger brother. He takes over when James dies. He fights for Parliament. He wants money. Parliament refused each time to give him money, so he dissolved Parliament indefinitely, like forever. Parliament forced him to sign a petition of right, which took power from the king. He did, but then he just ignored it, and he does this in 1640, 1640, 40, 39, 40, somewhere along there. So there is James and Charles I. Parliament tries to limit the powers of Charles I, and they start a war instead. The English Civil War lasts for 7 years, 6.5 years. You have the Royalists, the Cavaliers, versus the Roundheads, which is the Parliament army. And as you see, the Puritan Roundheads won. The Parliament Roundheads won. So you have an army that is raised by Parliament, and they defeat a king. This is important for U.S. history as well. This is why we don't trust, in our nation's early history, we don't trust armies, because they can overturn a government. As you see, they tried, convicted, and executed Charles I in 1649. He's beheaded. Never had a monarch been tried and executed, but Charles I is going to be executed in 1649. So, Oliver Cromwell's rule, as you see, generally during the war, he was a general during the war who led the parliamentary army, and now he's going to lead the nation. He establishes a republican form of government, a commonwealth. He squashes the rebellion in England, in Ireland. And as you see, under Cromwell, the Puritans are going to run society. They sought to reform society, abolish sinful activity, sports, theater, religious toleration for all except for Catholics. Cromwell ruled until his death, I believe, is in 1558, and the government will collapse. So, England will give the throne back to kings, and it's going to be Charles I's son, Charles II. He restores the monarchy to England, reformed legal system. James II is his younger brother. He comes to power, and he offends many because he's a Catholic. His wife's a Catholic. Parliament worries about a Catholic line of kings. They don't have anything to worry about until he has a kid in 1688, and it's a boy. So you have Protestant nation ruled by Catholics. They're going to fire him. So James's Protestant daughter will inherit the throne. Mary and her husband William were asked by Parliament to overthrow James, and they do. William invaded, and James fled as a bloodless revolution is known as the Glorious Revolution. So, what do the British citizens get out of this whole bloodless revolution, the Glorious Revolution? They get the Bill of Rights. William and Mary had to establish a constitutional monarchy. It limits royal power, increased Parliament's power, establishes an English Bill of Rights. The cabinet system develops, became a link between the king and the Parliament, advisor to the king. As you see, the leader of the majority party heads the cabinet, known as the Prime Minister. The English Bill of Rights also says Parliament, the ruler cannot suspend Parliament's laws, levy taxes without permission, interfere with freedom of speech, penalize citizens who criticize the king. These are all important reforms that will affect us in the U.S. We are finished.